The toughest union in Australia was definitely the one to avoid: the painters and dockers from Melbourne. If you messed with them, you could end up losing more than just a job. You might lose a limb or even your life. When Raymond Bennett's funeral rolled around, over 50 people showed up. But as usual, the underworld wasn't saying much to the cops. However, one thing everyone agreed on was that Brian Kaine had personally gotten revenge for his brother's murder. In Melbourne's shady criminal world, not many names are as infamous as Brian and Les Kaine. The brothers were known for being ruthless and violent, and they played central roles in the Federated Union of Painters and Dockers. Using their power, they made sure their will was enforced with a heavy hand. Their story is full of violence, brutality, and a never-ending hunger for control, which ultimately led to their deaths. Their murders completely reshaped Australia's organized crime scene. Let's take a deeper dive into the lives of these two brothers, once dubbed the most violent men in Australia. We'll explore how they climbed to the top, the bloody clashes that defined their reign, and how vengeance ultimately led to their downfall. Les and Brian Kaine grew up in Melbourne alongside their sister, part of a family where toughness was essential. Their father, Raymond Kaine, was a scrap metal dealer from Collingwood, and he was known as a hard-as-nails alcoholic. From an early age, he made sure his sons knew how to fight. Growing up in a rough, working-class neighborhood with a violent home life, the Kaines experienced Melbourne's toughest streets firsthand. This tough environment played a big role in shaping the men they would become, and it drove them towards a life of crime, making them some of the most feared figures in the city's underworld. Both brothers were skilled boxers, learning how to fight both in the ring and on the streets of Richmond and Collingwood. Brian, the oldest, was a Golden Gloves boxer, while Les had a more wild and unpredictable style, gaining a reputation as a street fighting menace. The Kaine brothers didn't waste any time diving into the criminal world. Les dropped out of school at 14 and quickly became involved with the Federated Union of Painters and Dockers. What started as a union meant to represent workers in the painting and docking trades soon became notorious for its shady dealings, including extortion, theft, and ghost payrolling. The Kaines quickly rose to lead one of the union's most violent factions, the Richmond Mob, which eventually took control of Melbourne's criminal scene. They earned a reputation for using extreme violence to get what they wanted, something that became a hallmark of Les's criminal career, leading him to face charges in court 27 times. Brian, while just as deeply involved in the underworld, was known for his brains. He was the strategist, while Les brought the raw violence. But when needed, Brian wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Together, the brothers climbed through the union ranks, using its power and connections to fuel their own criminal enterprises. They became feared enforcers in the illegal gambling world, using intimidation, threats, and violence to control the operations and take a cut. Brian also built a reputation as a terrifying debt collector, especially for the illegal off-course SP bookmakers. Once, when he had to collect a debt from a solicitor's office and the lawyer didn't pay up, Brian pulled out an axe and smashed the desk to pieces. The solicitor, terrified, quickly paid up. Despite their ruthlessness, the brothers were fiercely loyal to each other, always ready to back one another up in a fight. Les, in particular, was known for his explosive temper, which ultimately led to his downfall. One witness recalled a violent bar fight where Les kicked a guy in the head with his metal-toed shoes, practically stabbing him in the process. It was just another example of the brothers' brutal and relentless nature. Les Kaine's short fuse often got him into serious trouble, resulting in reckless public brawls. In one instance, he shot an off-duty police officer in the foot, and in another, he violently attacked two innocent drivers in a road rage incident, nearly killing them. With his unpredictable and explosive violence, it wasn't long before the Kaines found themselves clashing with rivals in the Union. One of their biggest enemies was the infamous armed robber and gunman, Ray the General Chuck Bennett. Bennett, the mastermind behind the infamous Great Bookie robbery, was a fierce opponent, and the conflict between the Kaines and Bennett was set to turn into a bloody showdown. On April 21st, 1976, the situation escalated when a meticulously planned heist went down at the Victorian Club on Queen Street in Melbourne. This was where bookmakers settled their accounts after race days, and Bennett had chosen the date with military precision. It was the first settling day after Easter, which meant the bookies were handling the proceeds from 3 consecutive race meetings. The heist was carried out in just 11 minutes, with the robbers making off with 118 calico bags of cash. While the official figure was reported as $1.4 million, insiders believe the true amount was closer to $2 million, a massive fortune back then. Bennett had instructed his gang to lay low and avoid drawing attention with flashy spending, but things quickly went sideways. Shortly after the robbery, Bennett's mother collapsed and died of a heart attack in a lawyer's office. When paramedics tried to revive her, they discovered $90,000 in cash hidden in her underwear. Word of the gang's involvement in the robbery spread fast through the underworld, sparking a deadly feud over the stolen fortune. The chaos this created plunged Melbourne's criminal world into turmoil, with Brian Kaine right in the middle of it. Brian Kaine, known as the Tax Man, made a comfortable living by instilling fear in fellow criminals. His reputation for intimidation made him the perfect person to demand a share of the bookie's robbery's loot. Brian Kaine wasn't one to take no for an answer, but neither was Ray Bennett, the mastermind behind the infamous robbery. Bennett, just like the Kaines, had strong ties to the Painters and Dockers Union, and was determined to keep the loot from one of Australia's biggest heists all to himself. The tension between the two sides boiled over into a brutal pub brawl between Brian and Vinnie Mickelson, a former close friend and member of the robbery gang. During the fight, Mickelson managed to bite a chunk out of Brian's ear, leaving him bleeding and humiliated on the ground. This public defeat was a blow to Brian, whose reputation as a feared enforcer in the underworld relied on his ability to intimidate. Being humiliated like this could seriously damage his credibility and hurt his business. The bloody altercation sparked a vicious vendetta, and Les, Brian's volatile brother, vowed revenge to restore his brother's honor. He made threats against Bennett and his family, promising to make them pay. While Brian was ruthless but calculated, Les was a man whose violence knew no boundaries. Ray Bennett knew trying to reason with Les was pointless, so he decided to strike first. On the night of October 19th, 1978, Les and his family returned to their apartment in Wantirna after visiting relatives. Unbeknownst to them, 3 gunmen were waiting in their bedroom, armed with silenced machine guns, ready to kill. As Les entered the bathroom, one of the gunmen dragged his wife, Judy, into another room. At that moment, the other 2 shooters opened fire on Les, killing him swiftly and brutally. After the attack, Les's body was dumped into the boot of his distinctive pink Ford Futura by a 4th man, thought to be Hitman Rodney, the Duke Collins, who had been waiting outside. Neither Les's body nor the car was ever found. Rumors spread that his remains were fed into a meat crusher in Manda, vanishing without a trace. It was a grim end for a man who had spent his life spreading fear and violence, now reduced to a horrific cautionary tale in Melbourne's criminal underworld. Judy Kane, fully aware of the criminal code of silence, did everything she could to erase all traces of her husband's murder. But the underworld knew that Les's execution would be avenged. The murder had crossed a line, violating the unwritten laws that protected women and children in the criminal world. This would not only lead to retaliation, but would forever change the nature of crime in Melbourne. Before Les's killing, targeting homes and terrorizing families was something no one in the underworld would dare do. But with his death, all those boundaries were shattered. The rules went out the window, triggering a surge in home invasions and raising the level of brutality. In the wake of this, there were 12 recorded murders, marking a dark turning point for Melbourne's criminal scene. The rumors about Les's murder quickly spread, reaching both criminal circles and the police, who launched inquiries into his disappearance. The 3 prime suspects were Ray Chuck Bennett, Vincent Mickelson, and Lawrence Pendergast. They were arrested and charged with Les's murder, but were acquitted in September 1979, largely because Les's body was never found. The verdict only stoked the flames of Brian Kaine's thirst for revenge. The acquittal drove Brian even more determined to exact his revenge in blood. After the trial, Brian approached Nelson's barrister, Philip Dunn, in a nightclub and issued a chilling threat. "I'm going to cut your client's Ory's head off and leave it on your front doorstep." But his vendetta didn't end there. On another occasion, Brian came across Dunn in a bar, pulled a gun on him, and reminded him that the situation was far from over. The tension reached boiling point until one of Brian's closest friends, Graham the Monster Kindberg, a fellow gangster, stepped in. He knocked the gun out of Brian's hand, managing to de-escalate the situation, at least for the moment. Even though Ray Chuck Bennett and his fellow killers had regained their freedom, they knew they were still marked for death. Facing another armed robbery charge, Bennett chose to stay in prison instead of seeking bail, thinking it would be safer. But he didn't realize that even behind bars, he was in grave danger. A few months after his acquittal, as Bennett was being taken to the Melbourne Magistrates Court for a committal hearing, someone scribbled a threatening message in the holding cells. "Ray Chuck, you will get yours in due course. You, Spampa Dog." The day of reckoning came in November 1978. While being escorted to the court for his robbery hearing, Bennett was fatally shot. Despite the heightened security following the murder trial, the police officers escorting Bennett were strangely unarmed and, even more unusually, weren't handcuffed to him, which was standard protocol. In a bizarre twist, a man dressed in a suit, wearing gold-rimmed glasses and a fake beard, approached the police and, in a chilling final act, said, "God bless you, bastard," before shooting Bennett in the heart. He collapsed and died shortly after. It was later revealed that Brian Kaine was behind the assassination, a move that became legendary in the underworld. Some believe he had inside help, possibly even from law enforcement, and that the killing was an act of vengeance for the murder of his brother Les. After the murder, Brian managed to escape the scene using a prearranged route, navigating through a car park and slipping through a corrugated tin fence that had been peeled back beforehand, suggesting he had help from someone who knew the area well, further fueling conspiracies about inside assistance. The violence didn't end there. In 1982, during the Gangland War, Vinnie Mickelson's brother-in-law, Norman MacLeod, became an innocent victim. Mickelson, having gone into hiding after Les Kaine's murder, had sold his car. MacLeod, a hard-working, clean-living man, was sitting in it one morning, warming it up to go to work, when two gunmen mistook him for Mickelson. They shot him 4 to 5 times, killing him in cold blood. 3 years after Bennett's death, Brian Kaine was at one of his usual hangouts, the Quarry Hotel on Leon Street, when things took a deadly turn. He was with a friend, Sandra Walsh, who was carrying his gun in her handbag. Suddenly, 2 men wearing balaclavas burst into the Quarry Hotel and began firing snub-nosed pistols at close range. Brian Kaine was hit in the head and chest. The shooters quickly vanished, leaving Sandra cradling Brian as he lay dying in her arms. Despite being rushed to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, Brian succumbed to his injuries on the operating table. No one was ever convicted of his murder. In a strange turn, one of Melbourne's rising crime families, the Morans, publicly expressed their sympathy for Brian's death. Young Jason Moran, as a child, even placed a death notice in the paper that read, "From your little mate, Jason Moran." That little boy would grow up to marry one of Les Kaine's daughters from his first marriage, and they had children together. Tragically, those children were present when Jason was shot dead during the Gangland War, illustrating the vicious cycle of violence that plagued the underworld. Brian Kaine's murder threw Melbourne's criminal world into chaos. His death intensified power struggles between rival factions and led to significant changes within the notorious Painters and Dockers Union. Billy the Texan Longley, a key figure in the union, began to expose its deep corruption. Longley, who had been convicted for the murder of Union Secretary Pat Shannon, used his time in prison to reveal the full extent of the union's illegal operations. His testimony played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Costigan Royal Commission, which uncovered widespread tax evasion, extortion, and violent crimes orchestrated by the union. Jack Puttynose Nichols, who took over as the union's secretary after Shannon, also became a central figure during this time. However, Nichols was found dead in his car with a bullet in his head, just as he was on his way to testify at the Costigan Commission. Many speculated that he was murdered to stop him from revealing even more about the union's criminal activities. Nichols's infamous quote, "We catch and kill our own," highlighted the brutal reality of the union's internal conflicts. Ironically, the revelations from Longley, along with Nichols's suspicious death, only accelerated the government's crackdown on the union's corruption. The Painters and Dockers Union was eventually deregistered, and new organizations like the National Crime Authority were set up to combat the deeply entrenched criminal networks. These changes led to more effective law enforcement and a decline in organized crime activities. The Kaines were one of Melbourne's most notorious crime families, feared more for their sheer toughness than for their wealth. Operating in an era before the rise of drug cartels, the Kaines' criminal empire predated the violent, high-stakes world that followed. Once they were out of the picture, the crime scene became flooded with drug dealers and big money operations, with guns becoming commonplace due to the booming drug trade. The Kaines really belonged to a simpler time, one filled with suburban gangsters rather than the massive, high-profit criminals of the future. Much had to change to bring an end to that old-school lawlessness. But this shift paved the way for a new breed of criminal. The Kaine story taught us important lessons. First, money speaks all languages. And second, greed and ego are the downfall of most. And that wraps up our look into the lives of the Kaine brothers, two of Australia's deadliest men. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to Dark Sleuth Secrets for more deep dives into the history of organized crime. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss one of our new videos. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions in the comments below, so feel free to share what you think about the Kaines. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep sleuthing.